So this is a simple implementation of WikiStack, which in terms of what this looks like is we've got a main page that shows all the stories that we have. So I've got 2 stories, Mitch has a story, Evan has a story. We also have tags here, but this is going to be something that's going to be secondary. This is the last thing we'll take a look at. So in terms of what our routes are, if you end up clicking on my name, notice the route, it's a RESTful route, users / very often you'll end up doing an ID, but this is sort of a vanity URL where it's actually the name of the user. So this is users prof, and these are all my stories. Notice that there is I'm only showing part of the story here. It's not a very long story, but when you go to the story itself, you can see the story's slightly longer here. And I should probably have put some dots here. This is something we could do. You could also see my other stories. Notice that my foo story doesn't appear here. These are basically just every story that I have aside from that story. I could end up going into my bar story here, and then I'll see my bar story, and here's my foo story. So, the 2 different looks here are going to be the user, and if I go over here and I look at Evan, right? Evan doesn't have any other stories here. I'm sorry. If I go over here and I end up drilling down into, these are Evan's stories, he's only got 1. If I drill down into one of his stories, I'll see he doesn't have any other stories here, and we can make the case maybe to put something like there are no other stories or don't show those other stories, but this is fairly, simplistic. There's some validation in the database, which we'll talk about. Haven't addressed how we're going to end up handling errors right now. If I go to save this, I'll get an internal server error. I could deal with that here and actually show what that error is, but that's a result of the fact that, if I say prof, my buzz story, buzz, 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 and I save, it's not good. I have to figure that out. Let's hope that doesn't happen when we end up doing the demo. Let's try this one more time. All right, that's interesting. Let's see what we now, I'm not going to go into that now. We'll figure it out. Slightly embarrassing. Anyway, maybe I could delete this from this recording. But that's always what happens. By the way, this is typical of why, on hiring day, no one really does any live demos, because invariably things will work 5 minutes before you do it. I just deployed this. I didn't go through every aspect of the deploying. By the way, this is also why testing is probably a good thing to do, which we'll go into afterwards. So this is all planned. Okay. In any event, let's get started and see how we're gonna do this. And again, one of my main goals here is that let me open up a terminal here. Thought I had one open, maybe not. Okay. So what I'm going to do here, one of my main goals is, again, just to sort of to learn how to use SQL, but also at this point to also think about a little bit about what the architecture of our application ends up looking like as we go along. So let's call this make directory. This is going to be WikiStack simple demo. And we'll go into this. And for starters, I'm going to start with the model part of it. And I will do an npm init y, and let me also do a git init, and I could even do a git.add git.commit m, my first commit, so we sort of get into the habit of doing that. I'm going to do an install, and I'm going to install Postgres and Sequelize, and I'm going to save it. Now, you're not going to turn into an expert on Sequelize by using it once or twice. It's complicated, plus there's a ton of different ways to do the same things, plus their documentation kind of stinks. So you'll get there. If something doesn't work, you put a question on Stack Overflow, you're probably not the first person that ran into a problem with it. Let me open this up. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to start setting up my app. So we're going to go with a user and a story. I'm going to set up my package JSON where I'm going to say start dev. And this is going to be, I'm going to assume that I've got a database URL. And we'll say database URL equals Postgres localhost. And this is going to be WikiStack simple demo. And I'm going to say nodemon server. So if I end up doing that, and I go over here and I say npm run start dev, this will end up starting, and obviously it won't find my server. So let's start setting it up, and we're going to be focusing on the model. So I'm going to go in here again, even though this is our server part of the application. And again, depends on how you want to set it up. If you want it to start and get your route set up first, you could do that. I sort of like to have my model there because then once I set up my routes, I've got something to work with. And if I get my model set up initially, the model I think is always the trickiest thing to do. So if you get your model set up, I think you're going to be in pretty good shape. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring in Sequelize. Again, by convention, this usually comes in as a cap. You don't have to. And I think the reason why this happens is that this is actually a constructor. And so I'm going to be able to create my database and say new Sequelize. And this is going to be process, environment, database, URL. And that should end up running. Nothing really is happening here. But let's go over here and let's set up a couple of methods here. First of all, let's start out by defining something. We're going to define, let's start out with our user model. User model is going to be pretty simplistic. Our user model is going to be db define user. And that word user is going to be important for two things. It's going to create the table, but it's also going to allow us, if we want to actually get that model back at any point. Let me show you what I mean. So this is our configuration object, okay? And if we just ended up doing this, I'm not going to see any errors or anything like that, but just for the sake of argument, if we go over here and we say db.sync force true, okay? Notice that we have this unhandled rejection, right? Database doesn't exist. The reason why it says that it's unhandled, catch e console.log e. Okay, that's what it means. When you see that error that says, hey, look, you have an unhandled exception, that means you had some promise chain and you didn't deal with an error that was in the promise chain. Now, notice that this red now is going to go to black, right? Because I am dealing with it, and now, I get my error that this database doesn't exist. So if I go over here and I create the database, I could go over here and go pSQL, create database, get that to show up, and either I could go and restart this, or even putting a space here. Now it's not going to give me any errors, and in fact, if I went back here and I connected to the database, WikiStack simple demo, and I say -d, I'll see that I have this relationship. So I want to have a name for my user. So I'm going to go over here. And again, I'm going to keep this really simple. Now let me show you, I want to show you a couple of things that are going to be meaningful a little bit later on. I could do this, and I could say Sequelize string. And if this works and I say d users, I should see that my user has a name. Okay, could do that. I just want to show you one other thing. When you end up creating this DB object, okay, there's some assumption that, look, you know what, you might need these Sequelize types at some point. So sequelize is nice enough that when you create a new sequelize object, it gives you access to this thing through this property called sequelize. And this will give us the exact same thing. Okay? This is going to be important a little bit later on, but I want you to know that if you can actually get to this, if you have a DB object, this is our, when I say DB object, this is our entree into all of our models and everything like that. This is what we can end up doing syncing with. Let me just show you something here. If I say console.log db.models, okay? So anytime that I want to get at my user model, if I was to say db.models.user, triple equal sign user, meaning are they the exact same thing? Absolutely. Okay? I'm going to show you why that's important later on because, well, I'll put it to you like this. Very often you want to separate your models into separate files. You're going to get complicated. Okay? But you're going to want to have some interaction between those two models. What you don't want to do when you're using the common JS pattern is to have one file that's dependent upon another file, and that file which is you don't want to establish circular dependencies. They get very confusing. So the point is, if you are in your user model and it's separate, if you want to get access to a different model, as long as you have your DB object, you can do db.models and get the name of the model for you. So that's something that is going to be helpful for you. So once we end up having that, let's actually sort of set ourselves up a little bit here. Let's actually create a sync method. And the sync method is just going to be return db.sync. And so now instead of calling db.sync, I could call sync and catch any errors. And I don't catch anyone, so I think I'm in pretty good business here. Let's also set up another.
Can I ask you something fast?
Yeah.
You mean that on line 6, if you didn't have DB prefacing the sequelized string, your console log wouldn't work?
No, it's totally unrelated. Oh. This just gives me access. If you have your DB object, right, certain things you could do with your DB object is you could find your models, and your DB object will actually give you access to this sequelize object, which allow you to get your types. Okay? It automatically goes along for the ride. Even though I say new sequelize, I'll show you where I'm going to use it later on, which will probably make more sense. What I want to do here, let me take this out. I'm going to do a const. I'm also going to do a seed here. So when we end up seeding our data, when we seed our data, we're going to probably want to go in here and say, I'm going to change this to seed. And when we go and seed our data, we're going to sync and then do something else. Right? So again, make sure that whenever you use promises, don't forget that return. You always need to return it if you're going to call then on it. So, or catch or whatever it is. Let's actually do this. Then your data is seeded. Okay? So let's go up here and actually seed some data. We're creating our tables. And so let's go over here when we go to sync. We'll do sync then. And we'll go over here and we'll say user.create name prof. And we could see that this ended up inserting the data. If we really wanted to be sure, we could say select star from users. Okay? So let's seed some data, but also we're not only going to have a user, we're going to have a story. And its most simplest form, story is going to have a title. Again, I'm not going to worry about validation right now. It's something that I'll show you how to do a little bit later on. Okay, we're just sort of thinking, the other thing is like as you're starting to develop, think happy path. Don't think about, hey, the user might not give me a title. big happy for the moment, right? You're not releasing it yet. Eventually, you get in your validations. Don't get bogged down. This is the first time that you're working with this framework. We're going to have a title. Our content is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be text because we want to have actually put in more data than 255 characters, which is what SQLized string does. And if you didn't know that, we could go over here and let me actually put an equal sign here. So if I go over here and I say D stories, I could see that this is a text type, and this is going to be 255 characters. Again, our primary key and some other stuff is set up for us as well. So we've got our title and our content. I'm not going to worry about tags at the moment. We'll get into that later on. Once we end up having these two things, we could go over here and let's set up some relationships. Story belongs to user. Okay? User, by the way, either one of these things, user has many story. Okay? Either one of these things will create the foreign key. Trust me. Okay? The reason why you end up doing both of them is if you want to use your story object and you not only want to find the story, but you want to include the user that's associated with it. You're going to be able to do that because you have story belongs to user. And if you want to go the other direction and you have a user object and you want to find that user stories, okay, that's why you go in the other direction. If you felt like you never wanted to get the stories for an individual user, you wouldn't need that. But I say put it in. Doesn't hurt you, and you might need it at some point. Thank you. Okay, so assuming that this works, if I do D stories, I should see that foreign key ends up getting set up. So let's actually start doing a little bit of code just from this. Now, one of the things that I would like to do, let's actually go in here, and we'll keep this relatively simple at this point. We have a user here, so I'm going to do a then user, and at this point I could do story dot create. My title is going to be foo. My content is going to be foo, 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 and my user ID is going to be user.id. So again, not only am I creating a user, but I'm creating a story for that user. And if I say select star from stories, I should see that story. Okay, let me give myself another story. So now this, where this ended up creating a user, this is going to be a story. And I'm just going to reuse the stories user ID. Right, because the story has a user ID. I'll name this story, good story might be bar, right? Bar, bar, bar. And if I say select star from stories, and let's just see, I think I have a semicolon here, that's why it didn't run. Now I'll see those two stories. Let me also add Mitch in here as well. So I'll go down here, and this is going to be user create, and I'll say Mitch, and Mitch is going to end up writing about Baz's. Again, not exciting, but enough to get us started. And his user ID is going to be the user ID. Oh my God, hold on. You're not kidding. So here, let's do this. And we'll say select star from stories. And that's enough probably to get us started. 2 users, 3 stories. Good enough.
I know I'm asking you questions. Can I ask you a very quick question?
Yes.
It's right there. Go back to the, when you're creating each of these thens, is using a sequelize method, which returns a promise, which is why this can go in this little chain. You're getting promises back. The first one is seed equals a callback. And is that callback creating a promise?
It's not a callback. It's a function call. And sure, that function call is calling db.sync, and db.sync also creates a promise.
I just wanted to follow that.
Yeah, pretty much everything that you're going to see in Sequelize is always going to be promise-based. The one thing, and it's really worth noting, everyone's going to do this. You're going to forget to put the return there. I'm almost sure that it happened when you ended up going through the workshop on your own. You're going to forget the return. It's going to say, I don't know what then is, and that's why you end up running into that error. So what I want to do here is now, once we ended up doing this, let's now do a commit. It's good enough for our models. Git.add dot, git.commit, get my models set up. Okay? Now what I want to do is actually show you a little bit of architecture of how I like to set these up. What I like to do is I like to create a folder called DB. Okay? Within DB, I like to add at least 3 files. I like to add my index.js, which is going to be the first thing that loads. I like to add my db.js, which is actually going to be that DB object that I showed you that we used before. And I also like to add my different models. So I would say user.js, and I would say story.js. Okay? And I'm going to go through this selectively and pull these things out. Again, without breaking things, where in the end, what we're going to be able to do is reduce this server.js line down to really one line of code. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by taking these 2 lines and putting them in DB. This is my baby. I need this guy. Okay? So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say module.exports equals DB. Okay? I'm going to need that again. Keep in mind, common JS syntax. This doesn't get created every time you require it, just one time. Okay? So this is one of the things that I'm going to need. This is shouldn't break anything. I'm not actually using anything. Nothing's really changing. Try to do this without running into anything breaking. I'm also going to take my user and bring my user over here. Now, my user, notice, is going to need my DB. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say const DB equals require /DB. Notice I didn't have to do require or sequelize because DB, remember I showed you before, DB gives you back sequelize, and this becomes pretty small, and now I just need to make sure that I do module.exports equals user. Okay? So I'm setting up my models separately. Let me go into my server.js, do the same thing with my story. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say const db equals require /db. I need that because that's going to be going to give me the connection to my database. And again, I'm also going to want to do module.exports equals story. Okay, now I've got these 2 guys going here. And I'm going to go back to my server. And I'm going to take this code that I have here. Actually not. I'm going to take this code here, my relationships, go back in here, and I'm going to put them into index. Now, obviously, there's a few things that I'm going to need here. I'm going to need my DB. I'm going to need my user. and I'm going to need my story. So now I've got those three things. I can go ahead and I can set up my relationships. I've got my sync method here. I've got my seed method here. And what I would say here is that now what you can do is that you can do a module.exports. Now what I like to do is pass back, when you ask for my DB, I'm going to give you my models. Okay, what are my models? My models are going to be user and story. Again, with the ES6 syntax, I don't need to put anything else here. I'm also going to go over here, and I'm going to end up exporting my seed and my sync. Now, if this is correct, what I should be able to now do over here is go to my server and take out all this stuff here. And instead of just saying seed, I could say const db equals require /db. That's going to go and get that index file. That index file is going to have not only my models, okay? So if I went over here and I said console.log db.models, I could see my models, but it's also going to have this seed method as well. And if this is written correctly, you should see my two models, right? And you should also...
Wait, where did the models come from? Where did you find that relationship?
The models were very simple. The models were basically pulled in the user, pulled in the story, and exported them in a models property. I like to do that. The reason I like to do that is there might be things that I'm going to do with that involve my database. Okay, syncing, seeding. Maybe there's some. Those are the main ones, right? Syncing. I want to seed. I might want to be able to do those things, and I want to keep my models separate so I can see what my models are. So anytime I get my DB object, I can get whatever models I end up using in my application. Now, once I do this, and here's we can go over here, right? You're gonna refactor early and often, get.add dot, get.commit, and I would say set up DB structure. Again, it's not, you have to sort of think about it a little bit. Again, the way that I think about it is I keep this guy separate, export them. Once I have that guy separate, I can define all my models separately, different files. You don't have this huge file with everything going on in it. And you have your index, which is putting all these things together. And this is where I would define the relationships. So you can see all your relationships in one shot. People might have other ideas about how to do it. To me, this has been pretty successful. And it's definitely a starting point. So once you end up doing that, and again, this is something else that you're going to see. As you're starting, when I said, you want to build something, you want to build something simple. If you have a file, you see that file getting on to huge number of lines of code, think about the fact that it's not going to be that easy to maintain. Try to keep things pretty small, the same way that you keep your methods as minimal as possible. You see a file that's getting too big, think about there's got to be some logical way to separate things out. This was a no-brainer. Separate out the models into different folders. Different files. Now, once I do this, let me go in here and let me say npm install. And I'm going to jump the gun a little bit. I'm going to bring in Express and I'm going to bring in Swig and I'm going to say save. And let me go back here to my server. And at this point, I'm going to say const express equals require express. I'm going to say const app equals express. I'm going to say app dot get, and I'm going to jump the gun a little bit. Request response next, and I'll go over here. Even though this is not going to work yet, I'll say response.render index, even though it doesn't exist. I'm assuming that we're going to set it up at some point, and we want to listen. So I'm going to say const port process environment port, or 3000. And I could say app.listen on this port, console.log, backticks, listening on port. Backtick, close that. Let's move this over. And if this works, we should at least be able to go up here and say, so I've got this error that says no default engine was specified. So these are our 4 lines of swig. Const swig equals require swig. Swig set defaults. Cache false. App.set view engine HTML. It's going to look for an HTML file and an HTML engine. App.engine HTML swig.render file. When I do that, I end up getting a different error message. And that error message is that it can't find the index in the views directory. So I'm going to go over here. Again, nice and simple. Views. This is a directory, index.html, and we'll start out by just doing this without a layout page, but we are going to use one eventually. Okay? Even now at this point, we could go in here, git.add, git.commit, added swig and express. Right? And if this was up on GitHub somewhere, you would do a git.push, and you would end up pushing it there as well. So what I'm going to do here is now let's actually use our models. And the way that we're going to do that is that when we call get, we're going to say db. We want to get all the stories. So we'll say db.models.story, find all. We'll do it then. This should give us our stories. And we'll say response.render index stories. And also, if we do have some error there, let's do a catch, and we'll end up getting our error. So we'll say E. By the way, if you want to see your error on Heroku, because Heroku locally will be able to see the error. So let's actually see without the error. And we'll introduce an error. So right now we just see hello, but if we go over here, by the way, did anyone get this error? I got it a bunch of times. Maximum call stack size exceeded. If you ever tried, what happens is that this is sort of a complicated object, and there must be something too deep where Swig is choking on it. So if you just get its JSON representation, you'll see that these are our stories. Now notice we'd like to have our user as well. So let's sort of set this up. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do an unordered list. And I'm going to go over here and I'll say for story in stories. And I'll go over here and I'm going to do a list item. And for now, let's just put in the story.title. We'll say by. We'll say story.user.name. And we'll see that we don't have any by over here. And the reason is that what we want to do is that we want to do an include. So when we do the find all, we want to go over here and do a where, do an include. And what do we want to include? And this is going to be db.models.user. There's an association between a story and a user. And once we do that, we end up getting the username as well. Now, what we could do here is we could actually set up a couple of other things here. Let's go in and say that what we want to do here is we want to go to the individual story. So I'm going to do an href for slash. And again, we're going to do RESTful route stories. And we want to have this vanity URL. So we'll say story.name, story.title. And we also want to have a link that goes to the user. So we'll go over here and say href equals slash users slash, we'll say story.user.name, story.user.name. And we could separate these out so it's a little bit easier to read. And let's take a look and see what that gives us. So now we've got these links that obviously don't end up going really anywhere. Let's do one other thing here. Below this, let's also put a summary for the story. Right now, we could actually put the entire story, but let's imagine that the story is pretty big. So if we went over here and said story.content, all right, granted, we don't have much content here, but let's be silly. We'll say that we're going to only use the first 3 characters for our summary. So right now, we don't have a summary. Not going to get an error because Swig just says, well, I don't really know what you're talking about. But let's go back to our model. Now, what we are going to do here is that we're going to do something which is a virtual method. And it's something we did yesterday, although there's an easier way to do it that I'm going to show you. So when we go to the story, this second parameter allows us to set up a bunch of different things. What we're going to set up are called getter methods. And what getter methods are basically just properties that we could end up accessing, but they're computed properties. So even though we're setting up, and that's why they're called getters. Getters basically are properties, but we're setting these up as methods. This is going to allow us to say summary. Now, this is kind of important here. Fat arrows are great. Let's see if this works. What I'm going to return here is I'm going to return this dot content, and I'm going to slice from the 0 to, let's say, 4 characters. Okay? So one of the problems that you run into is that slice is good. It keeps the context, but we really want to get the context for this object. I mean, what it's really doing is that it's kind of blowing away the context for us. Sometimes it's good. In this case, it's not so good. I could give you some other examples of it. But right now, we want to actually get our content here. So I'm actually going to have to put the function in here. And maybe I'll figure out a better explanation for this. But this should give us what we were looking for. And let's just, for the sake of argument, let's use our I think I've got to do this. So we'll do slice, and this is just giving it to us as a string. We'll say join at nothing. Slice join is not a function, really. Okay, that'll work. And if we go over here, let's go over here. I'm going to break my rule by just getting this in here. So just to show us that this is some sort of abbreviation of the story. So one of the things that we can do here is we could go git.add.
You could have used just double quotes. I mean, not quote. Yeah, just parentheses, left and right parentheses instead of the word function. And that would work?
Would not work. And the reason why it won't work has to do with how context gets set. Again, I'll give you a better explanation of it at some point, but right now I don't have one. What we want to do here is, at this point, we've got our main page set up, and we're going to have to set up a couple of other pages. So one thing that might be a good thing to do is to actually set up a layout page. And so I'm going to go here. I'm going to take this. I'll be lazy. I'll copy it. Layout.html. And I'm going to go over here. I'm going to take this out because this is actually on my other page. And I'm going to say h1 WikiStack simple demo. And this is going to be a block content. You can name it whatever you want to. And block. And if we do that, we could go to our index page and say that this extends /layout.html. And if we go over here, we can say block content and block. And I'm going to take this stuff and put it here. And let's just make sure we don't have any errors here. Take this out. So that seems to work. We could get a little bit of styling in here, not anything great to look at. I'm just going to put it in line, style, font, family, and I'm just going to say sans serif. Just so if we don't want to look at that type, bothers your eyes, get something like that. We're going to spend the whole week on CSS, so we'll get to that eventually. Let me just also put this as a link that goes back here. This will be like our homepage link. Now this is fine, works perfectly well, but let's just pull something out here. And it could be that we could pull this out for no other reason that we want to separate out things a little bit, but I'm going to take this code. First, let me actually show you something. So one of the things you could do is if I go over here and I say include, this is something else you could do with Swig and just about any other templating engine. I'm going to include foo.html. Now what this will end up doing, if I include foo.html and I go to run this, it'll tell me that it can't find that file. But if I go back here, and actually let me put the dot here so it looks in the same directory. So it's looking in my views directory for foo.html, and I'll go over here and I'll add that. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put in bar. Of course, bar doesn't exist. But now I won't get that error. If I go back over here to my layout, to my index page, excuse me, one of the things that I could do is you could actually pass data to this view by saying with, and I'll say bar equals Baz. Gives me the ability to sort of separate things out. Again, it's like I'm passing this data to this template, and I'll see the word Baz. Now, one of the things that I could do here is that what I'm going to do is instead of calling this foo, I'm going to say this is going to be my story list item, okay? And I'm basically going to take all this stuff I'm going to go and I'm going to create a story list item. I'm going to paste this in. Now, there's really two things that I'm passing in here. I'm going to be passing in here the story, and I'm going to be passing in the user. Now, I know there are some things coming up which are going to make this important, so I'm going to do it now. What I'm going to do here is that I'm going to assume that you're going to pass me a user that has a name and a story. And I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to go back. Let me delete this foo. And let me go to my index. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to say, hey, look, include the story list item for each of these, but not with bar and baz. My story is my story that I'm looping over, right? And my user is going to be my story.user. And if I do that, I should be back in the same boat that I was before with my users. And this is going to be something that's going to make sense. Again, this is something that's new, partial view, which you can do with just about any templating engine. And I'm in control of what I send to my partial view, so I'm just going to send a story and a user. Okay? Now, once I end up doing that, one of the things, either I could think about going in and creating new stories, which is fine, or I could start setting up some of my other views and see how they're going to work. So let me do that. So right now, I have no story page. Who are you on? Jeff, that was you?
Yeah.
Oof. That was one of my students. I can't discipline. So I'm going to go over here. So this is my a story. And this is going to be my user. Let me set up those routes. So again, as a starting point, nothing really prevents you from going in here and saying app.get/users, and we're going to pass in a name. Request, response, next. And we'll go in here and we're going to say when this happens, we're going to go and we're going to find our user. So we're going to say db.models.user, and we're going to do find one, where the name is equal to the request params.name. And then once we do that, we're going to get a then, and we should have a user. And for now, we'll just say response.send user. And if we have an error, we're going to catch the error. And we'll say next with the error. In fact, let's do the same thing here instead of just writing out the error. What's that? Should be E. Thank you. So once we end up doing that, this is our users. We should get a user. Notice I don't have the user stories, which I want to have. So let me go over here and make sure that I end up getting the story for the user. Now, again, in the other previous demos, we could set these up as class methods as we want to, but we could always do that. Right now, we could put these in here, and at some point, we could make our routes a little bit dumber. We're going to do an include db.models.story because a user has multiple stories, in which case we'll end up getting my stories as well. So let's actually set that page up. So instead of actually outputting send user, let's render it. We'll render user, and we're going to pass in the user. So what this is going to give me the ability to do, right now, if I just did this, it's going to tell me that it can't find user in that directory. But I'll go in here and say user.html, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to take this, I'm going to paste this in here. I don't want you guys to copy and paste, but for this workshop, to get it done a little bit faster, we could do that. One of the things that I could do here is if I just went in here and I said not stories, but user.stories, and I went over here and I said the user is not the user from the story, but the user is the user that I've passed back here, right? This allows me to reuse this partial that I had before. So now if I go back here, I'm going to see only my stories. And I could go over here and maybe just put an H2 stories by user.name. Okay? And I could go back here, and let's actually just go over here for our index. All stories, right? And my stories or Mitch's lonely story, right? So once we end up doing that, and again, by the way, this thing, it's not like I ended up getting it right off the bat. I realized I was going to reuse it, and it just sort of helped me to do this in terms of separating this out. Again, was to say, hey, look, let me pass these two entities in here, both the story and the user. I don't have to worry about whether it's, there's a user underneath the story. I'm just going to pass those things in separately. Now, if I end up doing that, let's actually go and take my advice here, git.add, git.commit, add the user page. Okay? Now, once we end up doing that, let's go in and go back to our server. And so now we've got all the stories by this particular user. So let's go over here and think about what this is going to be. This is going to be app.get, again, RESTful routes, stories dot, and this is based on the title, right? There's a couple of ways that we could end up doing this. The way that I'm going to do this is to do a let over here for the story that I'm looking for. And I'm going to say story, find one. Which one do you want to find? Where? And the story that we want to find is going to be the one where the title is request params.title. And again, we can build this out a little bit at a time, right? This is going to be a then. This is going to give me a story. If I said response.send story, I could do that. I could also do a catch, E, next, E. So if I end up doing that, again, I know I'm not using this yet, but let's just see if this works. Story is not defined, so it's not story, it's db.models. And so here's my story. Now, notice I don't have my user, but that's okay. What I'm going to end up doing here, so I do have my story, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and once I have my story, instead of just setting my story, I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to do this. So now this is available outside, so that means that I could go in here, and I could say story equals story. So now I have it available. So if I wanted to, I could do it then, and I would be at the same boat that I was before by going in here and saying story. Right, I actually just put it in something that was available out here. So now it's available in here by closure, and I should be in the same boat. Okay? what I want to do instead is that I want to basically find the user because I want to get the user's other stories. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say return dbModels.user. Find, and I think find on its own usually will allow me to do story.userID. We could find out if this is true. Let's go in and see now if in fact I get a user. Find one, so this is actually, we'll use find one where ID is story user ID. Let's see if that solved my problem. I thought for sure that it was a find by ID, but I could be wrong.
There's a find by ID method.
There is, right? Oh, so maybe I should just use that. Okay, so I'm sorry. Let's keep it simple. So I'm going to do, most of these ORMs have things like this, find by ID, and we're going to find by ID, and this is going to be story.userID. So now I've got my user. Now, what do I really want from my user? I could pass in a second object here, which is going to be my include, and I want to include, because I want that user's other stories, db models story. And now I should get the other stories, but notice I really don't want bar, right? I mean, let's be a little bit more clear. I'm going to do a send, and I'm going to do this. Story and user, okay? And I'm going to go over here. So here's my story. Here's my user, okay? But notice I've got this bar story here again, which I don't really want, right? I just want to show the story and show the other stories, not including this story. So a quick thing you could do here is to actually go here, and if you want to do this, so this gets to be, I think I told you before, is that this is the equivalent of doing this. Model, db, models, dot story. This gives me the same thing. It's really the exact same thing. Okay? Still hasn't solved my problem. But I'm going to go over here and I'm going to actually do a where. And my where is going to be, hey, look at the ID. And what do you want to do about the ID? Well, where it's not equal to the story ID. This basically is a way of saying, give me all the user's stories, but not the one story that I have already. I want to keep that separate. So again, what this is allowing you to do is you're querying based upon an association. Okay? You're doing an include, you're getting the stories from that user, but not the one that you don't need, in which case I just get my bar story, which is the story I want to display, and I got these other stories where I'm just going to display some links for them. So once I end up doing that, I could do a render. And this is going to be rendering the story. Right, so right now if I went to run this, it would tell me that it can't find that view. I'm going to cheat a little bit. Oh no. So this is going to be story.html. And we'll take a look at it. This is going to be story and we've got a story dot title, right? Put a div under here, and we'll go over here and we'll say that this is going to be a story dot content. And so for this, what we could do is we've also got a user, and the user also has stories, in which case this should probably work the same way, right? For story and user story. If you wanted to make a distinction as to this is the actual stories that were the other stories for the user, if you wanted to, you could give this an underscore. And if we go over here and we put maybe an H3, other stories by user.name. Oh, let me fix this on the top too. So this is going to be story.title by user.name. So now once you end up doing that, now I've got my bar story. If I go to Mitch, I could see his Baz story. He doesn't have anything else. Notice actually I'm not finding. Hang on. Give me a second, folks. See if this goes on. It's up there. It's not on mine. Let me try something here. Bear with me one moment. Okay, you know, I might have to just work off this screen. Bear with me for a moment. So at this point, let's just see why that user is not showing up. We're passing in render story user. Let's just see if we have that user. How could we see that? Let's go over here. Let's see why that's not there. I could have sworn we saw it before, right? Let's do a response dot, instead of render, let's do a send, yeah. Very often when this happens, it's that I forgot to do a return, but I don't see that here. Okay, let's try this. So here's my story. My user is null. Why is my user null? Oh, see, I think I know what's happening here. The problem that I'm running into is that this is going to work with me. The reason why it works with me is that I have other stories. Okay, so let's good example. Let's try to figure this out. So here, I know I could get a story, okay? One of the things that I could do here, let's do this a little bit differently. We go over here right? So these are going to give me the user's other stories. Another way we could do this is to do this. We could do, here, let's do this. This might be even a little bit simpler. What we could do is here, these are going to be this is going to be the story. So we have the story. We could go in here and we could include the user, right? So now we could say include with this story db.models.user. Okay? In which case, even if we end up going over here and going to Mitch, and going to Baz, I'm sorry, we could see that we have the story and we've also got Mitch as well. So I think really what I want to do is that I want to have this story. That's good. That'll give me the user. But let's actually do something a little bit different here. What we're going to do here is that we're actually going to get the other user stories. We'll go over here. We'll say dbModel.story. Instead of finding by ID, we're going to find all. And what do we want to do? We want to find all of them. And we're going to do a where. So we're going to do where the user ID is equal to the stories user ID. And that's going to end up giving us the stories, and I don't think we're going to need the include here because we're getting the stories themselves. So let's take this out. So this is a little bit different here where we are going to get a story and a collection of other stories, right? So we have a main story, which is going to have our user on it, and we'll have other stories. We don't need to get the user again. But here, if we go over and do this, what's going to happen is that we're going to be back in the same boat that we were before, which is we've got the story Baz, and we've got Baz down here again. We don't want to get Baz down there again, so we're going to say, hey, look, give me a where the user ID is this, and we could go over here, and we're going to say, but do me a favor, when you get me this, I don't want the ones where the ID is not equal to the story.id. And if you do that, you'll see that we've got Mitch's lonely story here. It doesn't have any other stories. So it's a terrific story. So sorry about that digression. Again, sometimes this could be a little bit tricky. We're going to render our story. And let's go over here and take a look at this. So this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to say we've got our main story, which has a user associated with it. We've got the story's content, other stories by story.user.name. And here we're going to loop over the stories that we passed in, which really is other stories. And our user is going to be our main stories user. And if we do that, we've got Mitch, doesn't have any other stories, and I have some stories. Okay? So I go here, I see my story, right? And here's my other story. Now let's actually go in here. Let's take out some stuff here that we still, I think, have left over. This is on our user page. Let's take this out. Okay. So let's do a commit. Now the last thing that we'll do here is let's go in and set up a post route. So let's put a form in here. And we'll put this form on our index page. So we'll put a div here. We're going to put in a form. Our method is going to be post. Our action is going to be, here we're going to be creating a story. So we're going to go to stories. And we'll go over here and we're going to put in a couple of divs with some labels. We'll have a label for user. Put a line break here. And we'll have a input. And we'll give it a name of name because, in fact, that's going to be the user's name. We'll do one for that. We'll do another for our title. And we'll do another one for content, and this one will actually do a text area. And we'll give it a couple of rows here. What's that?
Tags.
What do you mean, the rows?
No, do we also need tags?
I'll put them in eventually. I don't think we don't have them in our model yet, but I'll put them in a second. So we'll go over here and we'll do text area. And if we go back to our main page, we should see our form. Let's go over here and we'll put in another div. And we'll put a button here. Type equals submit. Save. Oh, it should be content. So this is going to be content. And this is going to be content. And of course, when we end up clicking on this, we don't have a post route to stories. So let's set up that post route. And of course, we're going to need npm install body parser, save. Go back here to our server. And our body parser will set up here, app.use. I usually just do this in one line. I see sometimes you guys end up putting in the JSON body parser, but you're not really using the JSON body parser, so only put in what you need. Encoded, extended is false. And what I want to do here, just for starters, is say app.post/ stories, request, response, next. And I just want to say response.send request.body.
And the JSON body parser would do what?
If you were sending JSON over the wire. JSON parser parses JSON. URL parser parses URL encoded data.
The checkpoint we have to use JSON, right?
That's correct, which was confusing because you never did anything with JSON. No argument. What I want to do over here is that if we can get the request body, what I want to do is first, let's try to see if we can find the user. Now I know there's multiple ways to do this, but let's say dbModels.user, find one. Well, what do we want to find? We want to find where. By the way, did anyone use find where they forgot to put in the where clause? It's a common one. This will give you everything. It'll give you the first one, actually. Find one. We're going to do a where name request params.name. So see if we could find one. We'll do a then. Do we get a user? I'll make this a little bit bigger. If we've got a user, let's return the user. Okay? If we don't have a user, db, don't forget that return, dbModels.user, create, name, request not params, request body.name. Let me fix that up here as well. In either case, when we make it down here, now we've got a user. We don't have to sniff out errors because we can just put a catch at the end, something we had to do with callbacks. Once we end up getting a user, what we could do is we could say db.models.story.create. And this is going to be title equals request.body.title, content request.body.content, and user ID user.id. So once we end up doing that, assuming that that is going to be successful, at this point that would give us our story, but we're going to do a response.redirect. We'll just keep it simple and go back to the main page. If we get an error, we'll take the error and we'll call next with the error.
When you call next with the error, where do you go?
Well, if we were on Heroku, we would go nowhere. Okay, it would just say internal server error. If we didn't do it, we get that error that says you have an unhandled rejection. Where by putting in the catch, we're handling our rejection. And if we deploy this up to Heroku, what we can do here, sort of on the bottom of our routes, if we do an app.use and we put in 4 parameters, error, request, response, next, what Express does is Express will call this route in the development environment, it'll end up showing us the error. But if we wanted to see it in the production environment, we could send our error so we could see it.
Or make it so that it's pretty.
Pretty, or send us an email so we know, someone in an email so we know where the error is.
So that's your catch-all.
That's my catch-all for my errors.
That's your name.
Right.
That's
But there's also a catch-all you could use if you didn't match any routes. This is our catch-all for our errors. It's our error handler. You can have multiple error handlers too and call next on them if you wanted to, although I'm not sure why you would. So in this case, when we end up doing our post, let's just look at it, find one. If we find one, we return the user. If not, we create the user. We have a user. We should be able to create our story. And let's go over here and test that out. So it's long enough that Mitch only has one story. Let's give him another story. Mitch is going to write about Quag. Save it. And so now Mitch has 2 stories. And if we go to one of his stories, we'll see the other story below it. So let's actually now that we did this, right? Again, also notice something, that you had seeded data that was there. That allowed you to focus on the site. Inserting is always the harder thing to do, although it didn't really sort of feel like it here. But again, we have some data in our system. We could focus on the viewing of the data rather than any other post routes or delete routes. What I want to do here is let's say git.add git.commit, set up post route. Now, once this is done, let's realize that now our server file is getting a little bit ugly. So why don't we go over here and why don't we set up a couple of routes. We'll add a route for users. And I'm just going to start this off by saying app equals require express.router. And I'm going to say module exports equals app. I'm going to get back to this in a second. And I'm going to go over here and do the same thing for stories. So what I'm going to do here is now go back to my server file, and I'm going to take my stories routes, move them over to stories. And since I'm going to be mounting these on stories, I'm going to get rid of stories. Get rid of stories. The only thing that I'm going to need is my DB. So I'm going to go up here. Const DB, I'm one level lower. Require ... DB. I should be in the same boat that I was before. Let me go over here and do the same thing with users. So I've got users over here. Go up here. And this is going to be just name. And again, I'm going to need my DB. Const DB equals require ... DB. So now I should have these two routers, which is going to allow me to go over here and say app.use stories require ... routes stories. And do the same thing with users, in which case I should be in the same position that I was before. And that's because my data just got wiped out. Let's take a look. So here's my demo app, Mitch with his one lonely story, right? Dig down. I could see my story. I could see me. I could go back. I could see Mitch. I could see Mitch's story. So that seems to work pretty well. So in that case, what we would do is we'd go in here and say git.add. Separated routes. Okay? And the last thing that we'll do here is go in and set up some tags. So what we could do here is let's go to our models. And this is going to be under story. And we'll go over here and we're going to put in, we're going to keep this really simple. We're going to say tags. And in fact, all I'm going to do here is specify that the type DB sequelize, it's an array of DB dot sequelize string. And I could give it a default value of just an empty array if you don't provide one for me. And I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm going to go over here where I'm seeding some data, and let's actually seed something here. So if we're writing about foods, right, our tag is going to be if we're writing about bars, we're going to have bar as our tag. Here's Mitch's story. And let me actually put the word tags in here. Go over here, tags, and this is going to be Baz. Yeah, let's do that. So let's actually do another story for Mitch. Tired of picking on him. Thank you. So this. So let's go on this other story. We're going to say that this is the foo bar story. And this is going to be, since we're getting a story here, this is going to be the story.userID. And for our tags, this is going to be foo and bar. Let's just see if that ended up building correctly. I just haven't scrolled down for a while. And we could see that by going into our database and going over here and say select star from stories. And I can see I have my tags. So what I'm going to do with my tags is that what's nice about this is that if we end up going to our views, we've got this story list item. So one of the things we could do here is we could put a UL here. And we could say for tag in story.tags. And this is going to be a list item. And let's just put in the tag so we could see it. So here's our tags. We can see them on this page over here. And let's actually put a link on these. We'll keep this kind of simple here. I'm going to put an href. And so this is going to go to stories, tag, and the name of the tag. So I could get other stories that match that tag. And we'll go and put the tag here so you could see it. Right now, this is not going to be a route that works, but we should be able to see our links. And if we go over here and click on foo, we'll go to a URL, but it's not the one that we want to get to. So let's now go to our story routes. And so this is going to be a get app.get, and this is going to be /tag, the name of a tag. And we'll go over here and we'll say db.models.story.findAll. So this is a little bit of a trickier syntax. What do we want to find all? We're going to have a where. And what's the where? And we're going to say tags. And so these are called operators. These are sequelized operators. You've seen the non-equal one. We're going to say where tags contains, and we give it the array with a request params.tag. Now, if we end up doing that, the other thing that we probably want to do is if we're getting the story, we also want to include db models.user. And if that works, we're going to have a collection of stories. We could test it by saying response.send stories, put a catch. And let's see if this works out. Something doesn't look right. I think here I've got my include, which is part of this. I think I've got another brace here. No. Something is off. I think it's my problem is here. Here's my where clause. It makes sense maybe to break this on multiple lines. So this is my where clause. That's my contains. This is my include. And let's see if that works. So I've got my two stories that have foo in them. And again, what that should give me the ability to do, I'm going to copy this user. I'm going to create a page called tag.html. And let's say that this is going to be, and let's also, if we're going to do that, we'll say tagged with tag. And in fact, we're just passing back some stories. And in this case, we've got our stories, and each of our stories has a user. So our user is going to be story.user. And now if we do that, we should be able to go back to our stories here. Hold on one sec. Probably. Let me do one thing here. So here's our tag. We want to do a render. We're going to use a template of tag, and we're going to pass back tag request params.tag and also our stories. And let's see, if we go back to tag, we've got our story, user, tag. I think that this looks right. Tagged with foo, and we see things that are tagged with foo. If we go to bar, we see things that are tagged with bar. And if we go to Baz, we see the story that's tagged with Baz. I'm going to end this demo here. The part that I left out, and it's actually probably one of the easier parts, is the idea of actually deleting a user or a story. The only thing about doing that, if you have this connection of data and you're going to delete a user, again, depending on what you want to do, what Sequelize does by default, if you end up deleting a parent, which would be a user, it'll just set the user ID to null in the database for those stories. If you don't want that to happen, you could find all the stories by that user, delete them, and then go and delete the user. The only thing that you'd have to add in order to do that is that if you wanted to do this with a delete, this would be an additional 2 routes. You'd have to put in your method override, and you'd have to do it within a form because you have to do it through a post. But the only thing you really have to send back in that case would be the ID of the user. And there's no need for any sort of vanity URL at that point in terms of sending the name back, the ID of the user, or if you're going to delete a story, the ID of the story, in which case you could probably just redirect back to the home page at that point. So let me wrap this up, and then I'll take some questions.